Good morning and good afternoon, depending upon where you are now. Welcome to day 2 of the 12th LCS RNet annual meeting. Today, we have two overall focuses for our discussion. They are international cooperation and finance mobilization for climate neutrality. My name is Hideyuki Mori, the special advisor of IDES. I will be the facilitator for this opening session of day 2. In this session, we first have a keynote presentation by Professor Derk Loorbach entitled Mobilizing Research and Design for Sustainability Transitions. After his presentation, we will have a brief Q&A session. Professor Derk Loorbach is a director of Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, in short, DRIFT. He is professor of socioeconomic transitions and academic lead of the Design Impact Transition Platform, which is, in short, the DAY2 platform at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. He is one of the founder of the transition management approach as new form of governance for sustainable development. He is highly cited author and contributor to the scientific development of this concept. So, Professor, the floor is yours for opening presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mori. I'm very happy and delighted to be here. I was invited a couple of years ago to join your forum. And I already spoke about transitions, so I thought about how to update my story. And it's clear that in the meantime, I think the topic of transitions and of the question how to achieve transformative change has more or less mainstreamed. I think the last climate summit in Glasgow underlined, and the IPCC report that accompanied it underlined the global consensus that we have now reached, that climate change and biodiversity loss, I might add, is an existential problem. It's man-made, and we need to achieve some kind of profound, more systemic change. What I will do in my presentation is in 25 minutes take you through the latest insights and understandings from the field of transitions research and our ideas or hypotheses, you might say, on how to move forward from here. And indeed, my topic is on how we can, as researchers, also become more actively engaged in transformative change. Thanks to the introduction, I don't have to say much more about this. I'm based at Rotterdam University in the Netherlands, Erasmus University, and I have a dual role. I'll end my presentation saying something about that. These are my colleagues, a happy bunch of young researchers trying to change the world. This is a figure you all know. It's a bit old already from the 1.5 degree report. I don't want to repeat it, but I want to show it to introduce the origin of the transitions research community, which by now is a global community. Thousands of people at least have subscribed to the newsletter and are engaging with the topic of transition. The origin of the field is basically the reflection that policymakers and scientists made already 20 years ago, that while we are talking about sustainability and companies are investing in sustainability, and we have sustainable development goals and sustainable development talk, if we zoom out, we see that the pathway of development that we are on is still one of unsustainable development. So yes, the urgency increases and the consensus increases that we have a problem, but the way that we address the problem is not adequate somehow. The concept that some of you will know in transitions research is that of a regime. It's a term or a concept that we use to describe the way that societal sectors or systems are organized. And A regime refers not only to the structures of a societal system, so the infrastructures, the technologies, the rules, the regulations. It also includes values, the way that we collectively think, and the way that we behave, our practices. And the idea of a regime is basically that over time, we make decisions, we make investments, we build infrastructures, we make choices, we develop routines and rules, and they structure our life, but they also create what is called path dependency. So think of the mobility system. We've bought cars, we have roads, we have gas stations, we are living further away from our work, so we commute every day, which creates traffic jams, and we establish policy departments that make policies to manage road traffic. So over time, in energy, healthcare, education, we develop these kinds of regimes. They're hard to escape from, also because they make our lives easier. So what do? We make them better, we improve them. We think of innovation to make cars more fuel efficient or to use the road in a more efficient way. And the way that we operate within these regime contexts at the moment, and this is a recent picture from the G20 summit, they convened in Rome. This is the Trevi Fountain. The Trevi Fountain. For good luck, you throw a coin over your shoulder. And I thought it was quite a funny picture to illustrate how the way that political leaders, but also managers, are trained to solve problems. Basically, our society is now governed to some extent by a management paradigm that is all about risk management, that's all about implementing solutions, that is about how can we make the existing systems less bad, how can we innovate or improve upon the existing. One of the underlying fundamental ideas of obviously being that economic growth will generate the revenues or the money that we need to solve the problems, but it goes deeper. Also, my university has a very successful MBA and a public administration education, and we train basically students to think in terms of risk management, in terms of control, and how do we implement solutions. And actually that pattern where we try to stay in control, if we look at the persistent societal challenges that we're facing, is not adequate. What we see is we're being confronted with escalating crises. So while we try to take control on a small scale, somehow on a larger scale, the counter effects hit us. That's true for climate, but we also see it in the socio-economic domain. And obviously COVID, the past 2 years, is an amplifier of the pressures and the problems and the path dependencies of those regimes. We see it globally. We talk a lot about green recovery, but the vast majority of the trillions of dollars that are sort of borrowed to recover from COVID are used to sustain unsustainable economic models. Only a fraction is diverted to actually sustainable alternatives. So while COVID is increasing the instability of our socio-economic regimes, it's not yet transition. Transition is defined as a non-linear shift of a regime, of a societal regime that's always dynamic, but a transition is a process where it moves out of equilibrium towards a new future state. And we can look at historical transitions. There was a time when we drove horses instead of cars, or where we used coal instead of natural gas. But obviously now it is about future transitions. And then we use this concept, this X-curve figure, my colleagues call it. It's basically a storyline to start to explain what transitions are. Basically, they are a process where we move out of equilibrium, and the majority of the organizations and people is still trying to optimize from within the existing system. So we make a more efficient coal-fired power plants, or we manage traffic jams, or we try to reduce cost in hospitals. And by doing that, we actually invest more in that regime, and the path dependency increases. At the same time, society around us changes. So climate change, biodiversity loss, but also think of digitalization or geopolitical changes. They put even more pressure on actors within those regimes to do better. So that's what's happening on the top left of this curve. And if you look at historical transitions, but also how complex systems work, then that destabilization leads to a chaotic process in which also things disappear or collapse or are phased out, like we are now doing in the energy system with coal. But that's often a very chaotic and disruptive process, especially for people that have something to lose. So in this process, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of resistance. So that's the sort of the dominant, you might say even the death pattern in transitions. The other side is that very early on, and this is starting on the bottom left of this figure, people start to think about alternatives. So they come up with new technologies, new practices, new ideas, and over time they might become more serious and more professional, cheaper, and better organized. And what's happening in the middle of this figure is, and that would be my starting hypothesis for talking about transition management, is that we are in a process of systemic shift. And it opens up a period of 10, 15 years where we will encounter major institutional changes, escalating crises, but also a lot of uncertainty. At the same time, this is almost necessary to create the space for more radical and sustainable alternatives to emerge and to come to scale more quickly. So if we stay on the pathway of gradual improvement, we are, from a transition perspective, likely to hit more severe and disruptive crises the more we persist. If we are able to somehow open up and create more space for the emergence of alternatives and manage the phase out of everything that is unsustainable in a better way, that is actually what we would call transition governance. So the principles, and we started with this 20 years ago in Western Europe, but by now it's being applied and used globally at a lot of places. It's basically a mindset that is also the mindset of social entrepreneurs or designers or people that experiment. It's basically the mindset in which you say a transition and this disruptive, chaotic process is inevitable because the current regimes are unsustainable. Society is changing and we see alternatives. So we have a sense of direction. We want to move away radically from the existing regime where it is unsustainable, and we have an idea of where to start. But then the process in between is a creative process of, we say, learning by doing. So we have to do something and move something and develop something that we don't know yet. So we are embedded, we are in location A, and we want to move to B, where it is maybe sunny and nicer, and life is cheaper and healthier. But we don't know how to get there. The only thing that we know is we need to move. And this is actually also a process that is what designers do and what researchers do. So we need to, as researchers, shift from analyzing the problems in the existing system, formulate solutions and give them to policymakers, to also start researching the future that we want, which requires also a different approach. And I'll explain in brief how we do that at Drift, but also in general in transition management. An important starting point for us is always to ask the question, where are we? So we work a lot with governments, national government, regional government, businesses, and every actor has its own transition context. So it can be the energy system, but the energy regime is very different from Tata Steel, which is a big steel plant in the Netherlands that is now going to transition towards hydrogen. So that's a big, major existing industry. If we talk to energy cooperatives, they have a different understanding of the energy regime. So we always start by sort of probing what is the current regime that we're talking about, what is its history, and what are the transition dynamics. And that's an analytical, but it's also a framing exercise that we do. Based on that, we can make an assessment what kind of dynamics are at play in that given context. So over time, we developed different types of interventions or strategies to deal with transitions in different phases. So this is, we call it 1.0, is basically the situation where a regime is still relatively stable. There's not a lot of urgency. There are some alternatives, but they are really alternative and still weak. So transition management or governance can then help to create a transition narrative, introduce a new discourse, and also create space for more experimentation and empowerment of that experimentation. So a very quick example, we did a transition arena process last year. It was fully online due to COVID. And what we do is we select individuals that are in different positions in a societal regime. In this case, it was higher education. So in universities, in organizations representing universities, in applied universities. And the topic was the change in how we educate in relation to digitalization. So that created a whole narrative. I'll only show the pictures my colleague Maria Fraaien made from the dialogue. So what we developed with this arena, and it was 5 sessions, is a new kind of narrative where we use the transition perspective with the group to formulate basically a problem definition, which in this case was that the current higher education is mainly focused on diplomas because it's output financed. It's very much standardized. It leads to a culture where students are only learning to the test. And it's become, because of budget cuts, but also all sorts of other factors, a system that doesn't make students or teachers very happy. And it teaches mainly for professions also that might disappear in the future. So based on that, seeing, okay, there is a pattern where there's a continuous growth and it comes at the expense of individuals, teachers and students. Digitalization can easily only reinforce that pathway and escalate problems. So what came out as an alternative is a more radical narrative for a desired future transition, which is about individual learning journeys, which is about tailored education, and which is about embracing the possibilities of digital technologies combined with or maybe going back a bit to a form of education that's based on personal contact and small scale and curiosity. We have to see what this new narrative will diffuse, but what we already see, this was launched or presented a month ago. Because of the selective participation, this narrative is taken to all sorts of boards and positions and dialogues on a strategic level that influence decision making. So this is what you can do to an example of what you can do in an early stage, but more and more also we saw in our own experience that this sense of urgency at the regime level grows. So we have politicians starting to engage with transitions. companies that see, okay, we need a more radical strategy. And also these alternatives start to develop in more coherence and in a more collective sense. So for this context, we developed this transition governance mix saying, well, there is a more articulated idea of direction. So the dialogue should focus on doing three things. How can we further help build up the new system that is emerging? How can we change the rules of the game? Because there is political support, we can now maybe think about changing the rules of how a government purchases, or investment rules, or construction rules, or road traffic rules. We can change and transform the existing, but it's also about phase out. So in the Netherlands now we actually have phase out policies and phase out departments at our ministry that are proactively thinking about how can we manage the decline and the phase out of all sorts of economic activities that are just unsustainable, which is also still a very political issue, and certainly for companies is something that goes against everything that managers have learned. So the task of a manager is to keep the business or the organization alive. So thinking about phase out is a very dangerous thing, and that also we still need to develop further. One context in which we use this was in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I was involved in a project with the Secretariat of the Convention, which involved some 60 people, ministers, but also people from the finance sector, from the environmental sector. So the more strategic, enlightened people in that network, scientists, basically to discuss a new narrative for biodiversity. To change the narrative, but also to think about, okay, what could be the strategy? And this is a picture from the COP in Egypt, where this new narrative was introduced, more or less. And in these workshops, we had 3 workshops working with this X-curve, basically starting to see it shouldn't be about fighting against the decline of biodiversity, but it should be about empowering transformative changes in economic sectors that help to create a nature positive economy. So it's not about reducing to zero, but it's about creating a more radical alternative. And the idea of a nature positive economy is to me very appealing, because it says positive, but also that it sets a bar. So everything that has a negative effect in the environment or people should be phased out. And the hopeful thing is that in many sectors, mobility, food, energy, water, resources, we see the emergence of models that are nature positive, where we can actually create buildings with that create a surplus of energy, and that store carbon, that are beneficial for biodiversity. We can move to regenerative food systems, and so on. That's being sort of adopted in the context of next year. Finally, we will have the COP in China to discuss a new global deal for biodiversity. So, I mean, these are ways that research practice can come together to create new narratives and to change basically the orientation of policy and strategy towards accelerating transitions. But what we see as we move further, and in many ways, and this is different globally, obviously, but in the Netherlands, my own country, in energy, also in mobility and in food system, we are seeing more and more that we are entering this 3.0 phase, where sort of the institutional stability is gone. The alternatives are fragmented, they are there, but they are not at scale and they don't work at scale. And it creates, my colleagues call it transition space, it's maximum uncertainty. And in this context, obviously, there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of forces that try to restabilize, so bring back the old stability. But there's also a lot of actors now embracing transition. So if you look at the European Green Deal or what some companies are doing, you would think, okay, we're on the right track now. We are embracing transitions. Finally, it's happening. If we look more closely, what we see is that we are entering a new phase. The embracement of transitions through policy and big industries is still to a large extent a more proactive or more ambitious version of sustainable development, of improving or making less bad the existing institutions or infrastructures. So we get vegetarian Whoppers at the fast food, or we get sustainable packaging of meat. While on the other hand, there are alternatives that are also present, but they are much less visible. They are also less attractive from a business point of view because they don't really provide a business model, but also for a government, they might be much less interesting in terms of revenues, because a lot of the government finance is also based on our consumption, more or less. So in this case, we should sort of, from a radical sustainability point of view, shift in terms of our diet to a much more plant-based diet, to regenerative food practices, to different kind of food systems, and really transform the food industry as a whole. But somehow we are being caught in a process where we try to improve the existing industries. The same goes for mobility. My country is cycling based, so we have a sort of a historical advantage, which also creates other lock-ins. But from a sustainability point of view, we need to radically think about redesigning cities in which nobody has their own car anymore. We can still use cars, but we should use small cars. We should share them. They should be electric. But more importantly, we should design cities so that people can walk, can cycle, and can use public transport. And we should have an economic system that supports that. But that is in many ways a leap of faith that national governments find difficult to make. So rather, we subsidize electric cars. And I'm very happy that we're now seeing the technological transition to electric mobility. But if we don't also think about changing the culture and the practices and how to embrace a more radical transition, we end up still in a traffic jam looking for parking places. And we create a new ecological disaster with all those batteries. So our 3.0 hypothesis is really to think about, okay, how can we now empower the most radical possible transitions? There's so much technology, are so much social innovations out there that provide the basis for a much more systemic and transformative shift to a nature positive economy. Whether it's how you organize the commons on a local scale, how we develop ecological infrastructure, how we transform the built environment into a nature positive built environment, how we transform our mobility systems into shared and collective and inclusive mobility systems, or how we transform landscapes and how we produce food. There is a lot of practical but also scientific evidence that there are radical alternative models, and we see that the institutional momentum opens up space to mainstream such models. And I'm a curator of the Architectural Biennale, which is a 2-yearly event in Rotterdam, focused on architecture and urban planning, and how it can help support societal challenges. And the process that we're working with is basically to say, okay, these radical transition practices, we mobilize them, and then we bring in researchers with specific expertise on how to set up a new governance structure, how we can create a new economic model, how we can model the transition to a collective mobility system in a city based on renewable energies. So we can make a social and institutional design, but we also bring in designers, spatial designers, practice designers that can help make these radical transitions visible. What would they mean at scale? How can we visualize them? How can we also make experiences so that people can actually start to see that these radical transitions are already here? It's already possible to make steps towards a sustainable life. The idea that we have with this process is that it will help policymakers also to gain more confidence and to in embracing this chaos ahead, but it will also help communities to make their case and their business case towards the outside world. So I'll end here because this whole process of transition management 3.0 is also what we apply to our own university. Drift itself is a social enterprise of the university. I've been lobbying for a long time because what we see is that the way that I just described how we do research in and with practice also implies a transformation in our academic system. So not only researching problems, but actually co-researching desired transitions. So the platform that was just established is next to the faculties in our university and is basically supported by the board of our university, an attempt to create the space for this kind of an academic work. On the website, you can see our opening and our mission. And it's basically trying to do what I just described, make visible that that a lot of researchers are already engaging with transformative change and trying to push forward the more radical transitions outside of our university. So I hope I've provided some inspiration for your second day, and I look forward to having some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Loorbach, for your stimulating and informative presentation with a lot of pictures, illustrations, and diagrams. It is really nice also to see many young research staff working together with you. That's really good. Thank you very much. And now is the time for Q&A. And those participants who would like to put question, please write your question in this Q&A column at the bottom of your screen. While we are waiting for your questions to come, may I perhaps ask one question to Professor Loorbach? The work on transition management was initiated in Europe, but it is now increasingly being applied in Asia. Can you comment on any differences in the application of the approach between Europe and Asia? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for this question. I mean, it's always different, I would almost argue. So the principles I showed are very generic. And it's always a matter of translating it in or adapting it into a specific context. So whether it's the examples I gave, higher education on a national level, or mobility in a city, or biodiversity on a global scale, you have to adapt it to the context. That being said, there are major differences also depending on the political and social culture. So one of the elements of transition management is how we apply it in the Western European context is that it's very deliberative, and it's very much also based on discussion and on individuality. So individuals debating. In an Asian context, it's sometimes or often much more about a collaborative process where it's maybe more consensus based, less confrontational, but still with the same kind of focus on framing an existing problem and then trying to imagine an alternative as a way to influence short-term decision making. We've also applied it a lot, also colleagues in developing economic context, where it's different again. Then it's much more about empowerment and creating some form of organization where often the institutional stability is lacking. So that's why it's always necessary also to work with people or researchers or practitioners from the context itself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have now a first question from the audience. This is a very interesting one. It's about citizens assembly becoming popular in Europe. How these processes of elaborating narratives can connect to works of citizens' climate assembly that have mushroomed over the last years in Europe in particular and beyond. How researchers can help these processes?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting development, one that we're also actively promoting in the Netherlands, because they can create sort of an external forum like we saw in France. But then it needs to also have a political function. Actually, we just had a new Dutch coalition agreement, and the Citizen Forum is also part of the new plans. So the lobby was successful. At the same time, it's only one of the elements that needs to come together, because it's the way it worked in France is also that it informs policy, and in the end, policy is still the forum where the decisions and the policies are made. So what we want to do is combine it, the Citizen Forum, with a social activation process. So there are two ways that researchers, at least how we approach it, help these forums. One is by providing the right kind of support and knowledge, so that the citizens in the forum are informed, and that we help structure their discussions, much like I explained in the transition arena process, for example. The second thing is that we can use the Citizen Forum to organize all sorts of more explorative transition dialogues and processes based on what comes out of the forum. So that it's not only informing policy, but that it's also activating social movement or social innovation.
Thank you very much. And so second question is this: resistance to radical change are high in part of the society, and there are important inertias in infrastructure. How is it possible to overcome them given climate urgency? That's this inertia, or vested interest. How to overcome?
Yeah, there are different types of inertia. So if you think of infrastructure, often engineers can figure out a way to use infrastructure differently. Think of the energy grid or roads. So there's path dependency in infrastructure, but that can often be overcome. The inertia caused by vested interest is much harder to overcome, but history teaches us that at some point there's always collapse of power. So my colleagues working on power in transitions, they sort of have the argument that historically speaking, the only there are two alternatives. One is revolution, which is often very undesirable. So it's in many ways. So you remove the vested interest maybe, but you create chaos and a civil war. So the only alternative is erosion, which is basically creating a counterpower or transformative power or empowering alternatives. What our main focus is that in the middle of, obviously you have vested interests, but the vast majority of the people is just living their lives. But unknowingly, perhaps, they keep reinforcing those vested interests by sticking to their routine. So our idea of making radical transitions visible is that we can convince much more people or offer large amounts of people the perspective that there is an alternative practice that they can actually step into. So there are alternative regimes already emerging that also create stability, that you can become part of renewable energy systems, that you can slightly adapt your mobility behavior so that you don't need a car always, that you can change your dietary pattern. So those alternatives are already there, and I think by helping the acceleration of people that take a step into those new emerging regimes, that's a way to erode the power of vested interest. And then ultimately also within the regime, we see it in energy, certain companies will start to make the shift, and they will help to accelerate this movement of people to a new regime.
Thank you. Perhaps very quickly, the last question. What could be the role of international cooperation in this transition dynamic?
Yes, so we see that a lot of these radical transitions are locally rooted and globally connected. So in a way, we all have to figure out what this radical sustainability, this nature positive alternative looks like in our own context. But the way we get there and the way we get our inspiration our motivation is through global exchange. So what the example I showed for the Convention on Biological Diversity is on a global level, we need to create the platforms for exchange to learn trends locally. And we need to think about the core narratives, so a nature positive future. We need to think about the institutional conditions, so a carbon price or a carbon cap. We need to think about sort of international agreements that create the space for this translocal diffusion and those radical transitions on the ground.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure, including myself, I still have quite a bit of questions, like the implications of COVID-19 on this transition management and so on and so forth. But now our time is up, and therefore we need to complete this session. Thank you very much, Professor Loorbach, for sharing with us your very innovative, interesting understanding of this transition management. And also, I'd like to thank all the participants for your active participation as well. So thank you very much, and this session is over. Thank you very much indeed.
I was saying that my name is Sergio Lamotta from the Italian National Agency for New Technology, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development, ENEA. In today's meeting, we will cover the issue of international cooperation that is considered one of the pillars to achieve the goals of the Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. It is widely recognized that without international cooperation, the Paris Agreement goals will be impossible to achieve. During this session, we will have two presentations, the first by Mr. Marcello Capra, the second by Toshihiko Mazui. Following these two presentations, we will have a panel discussion in which we will elaborate more in depth on successful international cooperation. So without further delay, I would like to jump directly into the presentations. The first of Ecological Transitions is the Italian delegate to the Strategic Energy Technology Plan, the so-called SET plan, and he is also a delegate to Mission Innovation, a global intergovernmental initiative aimed at accelerating clean energy innovation. Just to highlight that the TEC, that is the Technology Executive Committee, established during COP16 in 2010, has included mission innovation in the list of good practices on international collaborative research, development and demonstration initiative of climate technology. Marcello, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio. Good morning and good evening, good afternoon to all the people, the colleagues which are listening to us. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay.
Marcello, go ahead.
Okay, I try to share my presentation. Can you see it, Sergio? It's okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, thank you very much for this invitation, this important meeting. I'm very honored to be with you. Thank you, Sergio, again, at Enea for the invitation. I would like to share with you the European approach in international cooperation, of course, passing through the Italian case. As you probably know, the main in Europe, we have two main drivers in the European energy policy. The first is the so-called Green Deal, which foresees a very challenging target of 55% reduction of greenhouse gas within 2030, of course, related to the level of emissions in 1990. This is the first very challenging step we have within 2030. The second one is within 2050, and is achieving the climate neutrality, the so-called long-term strategy that every European countries have launched in the last year. So these are the main drivers of our policy, energy policy. Just to give you an idea of what this means in our strategy, you can see the situation related to the emission now in 2020, 2021, that the intermediate step within 2030 of 55%, and then the final goal to have to achieve the climate neutrality. As far as the Italian case is concerned, you can see that our scenarios we expect to achieve in 2050 will have a non-predictable renewables energy share very high of about around 500 terawatt hours within 2050, of which a high share will be dedicated to the production of renewable gas, in particular hydrogen. So to achieve these challenging objectives, Italy, as all the other European countries, needs to invest heavily in research and innovation, but above all in the international cooperation in order to share experiences, researches, and of course, best practice. So Italy, as the other European countries, has defined at the end of the 2019 year, a so-called National Energy and Climate Plan that foresees 5 dimensions, one of which is dedicated to research, innovation, competitiveness, the so-called fifth dimension. This dimension is very crucial for our innovation plan and, of course, for international cooperation. You can see in this slide how this dimension is strictly related to the participation in other international partnerships or committees, as the International Energy Agency, the Clean Energy Ministerial, the Mission Innovation Partnership, and also to the European tools for supporting clean energy implementation. Horizon Europe is one of the most important framework program for research innovation, and also the Innovation Fund. Now, the two pillars of the Italian strategy for international cooperation in order to achieve the energy and climate targets are the participation to the SET plan, the Strategic Energy Technology Plan at the European level, and mission innovation at the international level. Mission innovation, as you probably know, is an international partnership that has been launched during the COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015, with the aim to promote technology innovation to support energy transitions by means of doubling the public investments in clean energy technologies. What is the SET plan? The SET plan is the European answer to the major climate and energy challenges. The SET plan was established in 2007, and it had a first intermediate goal within 2020 to promote a greater dissemination of technologies already available today all over the European Union. The second step is foreseen in 2050, of course, but also in 2030, 2040, just to have a number of steps in the next future. And the final goal is a collaborative effort in the industrial system. So the international cooperation in this perspective of the targets we have for the 2050 is very important inside the European Union, but all over the world. The SET plan moves from an integrated roadmap that has been defined during the last years at all the European countries level, and faces a number of challenges: consumer demand, system integration, supply, and also social and environmental aspects very important in Europe. And taking account, of course, of the three main important drivers of the European energy policies: competitiveness, security of supply. You know, Europe is strongly dependent on imports of energy, and of course sustainability. So the SET plan moved from the integrated roadmap definition, and after a very intense process of evaluation and definition of priorities at the level of European countries, has finally defined 10 key actions on which we have concentrated our efforts. You can see that these 10 actions are the main value chains we can have in the energy sector, from renewables, efficiency, new materials, and CCS, nuclear safety, materials, and so on. So for each of these key action, the European governments have set up a number of working groups which have strongly worked in these years in order to define the so-called implementation plans. You can see here in the right side all the financial volume of investment we need in Europe within 2030 just to comply all the needs we have in the research innovation of each key action. So a very high volume of investment, more than 20 billion euros of investment in 10 years for each key action. So a very important work we have done in these years. You can see for each European country the number of key action they have decided to be involved. Italy has decided to participate in all the working groups for each key action, also in the sector in which our industry is not working, as CCS nuclear, as you know, just to observe and evaluate all the developments in the R&D sectors. Let's move to Mission Innovation. Mission Innovation, as you know, is a very important partnership which has been launched in COP21. Japan is also involved together with other Asian countries, and this is a very important partnership. And just to give you an idea of the effort foreseen by the Mission Innovation Initiative, you can see that the countries that have joined the partnership spend around 15 billion euros per year when we signed the agreement in 2015, 2016, and the agreement is to double this investment in order to reach more than 35 billion euros per year. Of course, maintaining the business as usual, which is about 75 billion. So a very, very strong effort. How does it work? Through a number of so-called innovation challenges in this first phase of the partnership. You can see here all the challenges that have been launched in these years. I have, of course, no time to focus on each of them, but in any way you can see that are embracing all the spectrum of R&D. Our innovation challenges are in how do you say, are global calls to action aimed at accelerating research, development, and demonstration. And they cover the entire spectrum from the early stage with technology readiness levels, medium and low, up to high TRLs with demonstration projects. But the important point that the innovation challenges were developed through a collaborative process between the countries which have joined Mission Innovation. Engagements, of course, is entirely voluntary and is built around a coalition of countries that are interested in sharing efforts, research and innovation activities. This is a very important point. You can see here all the plan of the innovation challenges. Italy also in this case has decided to be present in all the challenges. And during the last meeting of COP26 in Glasgow, the second phase of Mission Innovation has been launched up 2030, the so-called Mission Innovation 2.0. And 3 new missions from Innovation Challenge, 2 missions have been launched. 2 of them are in the power system and on hydrogen. And international cooperation will be further strengthened in the second phase of Mission Innovation. This is the new approach we'll have in the next decade. In conclusion of my speech, I would like to give you 2 concrete examples of international cooperation in the clean energy technology sectors. The first one is the smart grid sectors, very important in not only in Italy but all over Europe. You can see projects, initiatives we have now in the European Union, about 1,000 projects in 50 countries, about 5 billion euros of investments, part of which in R&D, but also a very important share in demonstration projects. And this is very important because we need in Europe to move from research to demonstration of technologies. About 3,000 organizations involved, 6,000 partner participants with an average of 6 partners for each project and 36 countries involved. So a very strong example of international cooperation, smart grids. Since the integrated system, in our opinion, is at the center of the development of the European energy strategy, and coordination with other value chains, for example, renewables, storage systems, is very important and strategically very important in the European context. Also, Mission Innovation, as you have seen, is very focused on smart grids and energy systems. In 2018, in Rome, we have launched the so-called SGIII platform, Smart Grids Innovation Accelerator. And this will serve as a suitable tool to enable knowledge sharing of technical results and best practice with strong international cooperation. The last example I would like to share with you is the hydrogen sector. You know, is a very important issue all over the world. As you probably know, the European Union has launched last year a hydrogen strategy which foresees 40 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity installed. And also Italy has defined a preliminary strategy with about the final goal in 2030 to achieve a 2% penetration of hydrogen in final electricity demand with 5 gigawatts of electrolysis capacity installed. And in Mission Innovation is a very important goal for the international effort. And innovation is a cornerstone of the Mission Innovation platform. Members will focus on specific actions to foster international cooperation and develop together strategies to achieve the final goal, very, very challenging, of achieve a $2 per kilogram of hydrogen is very challenging, but so international cooperation is very important. How establishing knowledge exchange networks with the member states of Mission Innovation, working together just to define a database for clean hydrogen production, research and innovation projects. And of course, participating with other international partnerships, of course, the International Partnership on Hydrogen Economy, the International Energy Agency, the Clean Energy Ministerial, that has an important sector devoted to hydrogen, the World Energy Forum, and of course also with the European institutions. In Europe, we have a so-called joint undertaking on hydrogen. And we have a public-private partnership called joint undertaking with the aim of developing international cooperation among industries and R&D organizations. So the final goal of international cooperation in the hydrogen sector, in particular of the International Partnership Mission Innovation, must be the possibility to realize, to implement a number of hydrogen valleys all over the world. This is, in our opinion, is the final goal of the international cooperation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marcello, for your very informative presentation. Personally, I could have 1,000 of questions to you, and I assume that also the other panel participants will have, but we are running out of time, so I would prefer to go ahead, and I assume, Marcello, that you will stay with us during the panel, so we will have the possibility to exchange some views on your.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So international collaboration is a very huge, quite cross-cutting issue. So you can collaborate on, as in the example we have heard by Marcello, in the area of technology, in this case energy technology, which is in the area of mitigation. But you can collaborate also in the area of capacity building, in the area of finance. So it's very huge, so to say, scope in this particular area. So the second presentation will be done by Professor Mazui. Is the head of the Social System Division at the National Institute for Environmental Studies, NIES, in Japan. Toshi is also professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. And more importantly, for this presentation, he has developed the Asia-Pacific Integrated Model, the AIM model, and has worked intensively to transfer the AIM model to the Asian countries. He is also the lead author of the near to midterm scenario chapter at IPCC assessment report number 6. And the presentation title is International Collaboration in Asia. So Toshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Toshihiko Masui. So today, I'd like to introduce our activities related to our integrated assessment model named AIM, Asia Pacific Integrated Model. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our activity, International Network of AIM. So that we have developed our own integrated assessment model, collaborating with the Asian partners, including China, India, Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia, and so on. So today, I'd like to introduce the collaboration results and how to support the policy making process, especially related to the long-term strategies. So this slide show the some Asian countries NDCs and long-term strategies. So as you may know, the Asian countries has already some Asian countries have already submitted the long-term strategies, including Japan, and so the some countries long-term strategies. This our model AIM support. So this process today I'd like to introduce. Beforehand, yeah, so we are now moving to the 1.5-degree target world, but still our present mitigation target or goal is not enough to achieve the 1.5-degree target or 2-degree target. So we need more ambitious target. So in order to show or to show the roadmap to achieve this the accelerated mitigation target, we utilize our integrated assessment model AIM. And this is a chart of the emission historical emission trend and the goal of the GHG emission in Japan. So these dots show the previous old target, but now our present goal in 2030 is 46% reduction to 2013 level, and by 2050, our goal is the net zero or GHG emission. So our government will also set the goal of GHG emission at this the net zero. Of course, this target is not easy to achieve that. So by using our model, we assess, we show the pathways how to achieve. And generally, in order to achieve the low carbon or decarbonized society, we need several measures. One is a reduction in energy consumption. This is a typical introduction of the energy saving technologies. And second one is the use of lower carbon energy sources. So from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And third one is the electrification, energy transition. But in order to achieve the decarbonized society, these three measures are not enough. So that we will have to introduce the negative emission technologies like BECCS. And also, the role of the social transformation will be quite important to realize the carbon neutrality. So not only the technology perspectives, but also this social transformation is the role of this transformation becomes quite important. And in our simulation result for Japan, we also assessed the net zero emission by 2050. And in this case, we set two scenarios. One is rely on the technology. And the next one is the technology plus social transformation scenario. Both we can achieve the net zero by 2050. But in the case of the including social transformation scenarios, the necessary additional investment will be saved. In the case of only the technology case, around 11 trillion Japanese yen is needed as per year as additional investment. But in the case of the social transformation and technology, in this case, the necessary additional investment, annual additional investment is 9 trillion Japanese yen. So we stress the importance of the social transformation to achieve this net zero emission. And our approach is now applying to Asian countries. But the Asian countries are quite diverse. The background of the social issues and the economic situations are also quite different among the countries. But our final goal is common, so to achieve the net zero emission. So not only the developed countries like Japan, Korea, but also other developing countries like China, Thailand, India, Vietnam. So these countries also show the net zero emission. So we will have to assess or show the most appropriate the roadmap to achieve the net zero society. So in order to show this kind of the most appropriate roadmap, so we utilize the integrated assessment of AIM. And the quantitative assessment based on the AIM is needed to show the future scenarios and roadmap toward the decarbonized society. And this is the main chart, the pathway on the investigation of the to assess the decarbonized society. So not only the quantitative analysis, but also the qualification, the narrative storyline is also quite important. And also some trial and error process, the discussion with the stakeholders are also quite important to sophisticate the scenarios. So through this process, we can show the decarbonized society actions and roadmap. And in our activities, we utilize the three models. One is a extended snapshot tool. This is assess the target year's activities. And we discussed with the stakeholders, and we fixed the final goal. And then we, by using the end-use type model, technology-based model, we show the roadmap, the technologies roadmap to achieve the net zero emissions. And by using the CG model, we assess the economic impact. And by combining these three results and the model, we draw the decarbonized development actions and more. And so in order to show these roadmaps in developing countries, we need the strong support by the government and the research institute. So our team supports the Asian Research Institute to show the roadmap. And also the MOEJ, Ministry of Japan, Environment of Japan, or Embassy of JICA, will support the government or some set the agreement between two countries. And of course, finally, the government will show the NDC and NDC. So in order to quantify to set the target, the goals, our academic side will also support by providing the necessary scenarios. So by these structures, we support the set of the NDC and long-term strategies in developing countries. This is a typical example of our activities. This is a South National Communication published by Thailand, and our colleague, Professor Pundit, Thammasat University, is supported this activity. And also, in the case of Thailand, Professor Pundit, simulated to quantify the long-term strategies of Thailand. I think at the discussion, Professor Pundit will explain the more detail about the Thailand, the long-term strategies. And also for Indonesia, we supported the long-term strategies of Indonesia. Of course, the simulation itself will be done by the local researchers, like Professor Rizaldi of Togor Agricultural University and Professor Letono and Professor Uchok of Bandung Institute of Technology. But our team support to quantify the long-term strategies in Indonesia. And at this moment, we are now supporting the Vietnam long-term strategies. So the last August, Minister of the Environment and Monday agreed to this joint ministerial statement, and we assessed the long-term strategies, the future, the roadmap. And last month, between Japan and Vietnam, they agreed this joint cooperation plan on climate change for the carbon neutrality by 2050. So we are now quantifying the roadmap to achieve the carbon neutrality by 2050 in Vietnam. Okay, so this is the final slide. In the case of Japan, the plan for global warming countermeasures mentioned that our model AIM will be utilized to support the climate policies and capacity development for the decarbonized society development in developing countries. I think the final goal is that the developing countries will provide their own decarbonized scenarios. And the researchers in these countries will simulate, quantify their own long-term strategy. So our role is to support this academic work and the process of the quantification of the long-term strategy. And through this collaboration among the Asian countries, we can support the activities for the decarbonized society of Asia. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Toshi, for your intervention, for giving us a complete panorama of the activities Japan is putting forward together with the Asian countries. So I would invite the panel participants to join the panel. In the interest of time, I would jump directly into make some specific question to each panel participant. So we have heard, so to say, the voice by Japan, which represents, so to say, the offer side of this cooperation, of this international cooperation. We have now the opportunity to hear from Professor Bundit from the Serindon University in Thailand, which represents perhaps the kind of demand side for this for this action. So I would ask Professor Bundit what is his experience in using this model, and what kind of impact he can highlight for using this model, because it is very important to highlight the impact of this international collaboration, because the demand is increasing, but also we have to demonstrate an increasing impact of this action, as Marcello has shown in the case of Mission Innovation regarding the impact on finance, for example. So, Professor Bundit, may I ask you to provide us a narrative on this side?
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you also, Dr. Basui and NAS, okay, that support many, not only ASEAN countries, Southeast Asia, but also including other countries such as India. For climate change mitigation and aim in Asia, may I share what my slide. Yeah. So I think I hope you can see my slide.
Yeah.
That few slide. Yeah, that few slide. Yeah, that few slide. Yeah. We learn aim from NAS, as you know, like many ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, Indonesia, other. More than 10 years ago, about 2009, 2010, the first is what aim extended snapshot. Yeah, this one I think Dr. Busui already explained. Okay, to develop scenario of low carbon city, low carbon society for Thailand 2030. And then immediately due to our background like in optimization like end use, so we use end use like and we develop our own brochure for Thailand. The first brochure supported by NAS like under the project of MOEJ, and the second brochure we developed by ourselves using MNU in the year 2012. This brochure is a booklet, include the roadmap. This is very important that this roadmap, like finally, we present to Ministry of Environment Thailand and the Climate Change Focal Point. The roadmap include several action like that we learn from Japanese side, like this is the demand side, like supply side. We include power sector, we include transport industry, building, household, and other many action. And this kind of roadmap finally, like we work with Climate Change Focal Point and Government of Thailand to develop INDC like in 2014, and finally Thai government announced like the result of the study at the Paris summit in 2015, like, and the roadmap here that we use MNU. And before the COP, like in October, the government of Thailand submit a long-term strategy. This long-term strategy, in fact, we also use M model, but now we integrate like not only MNU but also the CGE model from Dr. Masui, and we find out that for the case of Thailand, like we could achieve net zero greenhouse gas within the second half of this century. But I know that it's not enough. We have to accept the time. So that's why in terms of carbon neutrality, we found that we could achieve it by the year 2065. Anyway, you may hear that the President of Thailand are now in the COP 26 that Thailand carbon neutrality year is will be 2050. So that means the gap that 2065 and 2050 now will be the big problem for us, right, in terms of modeling, and we have to tell the government how to achieve. That means we have to find out the pathway and trajectory to meet the target of carbon neutrality 2050. The process we did since NAMA Copenhagen Accord and INDC are here. Yeah, so we involved in national consultation. Like in national consultation, Ministry of Environment Thailand make the working group. Okay, energy one group, transport one group, waste one group, IPVU industrial process and product use. We classify this group due to our suggestion should be according to IPCC sector. Okay, including social economy to see, for example, SSP. Okay, and with national consultation, our process involved here, and we fine-tune. Right, Dr. Masui mentioned that we fine-tune the result of the model until consensus, and then the ONEP, the focal point of Thailand, like will deliver this kind of result to the government and cabinet approval before we send to UNFCCC. Yeah. So this is the model in the process in long-term strategy that we did like this year. We use MNU, which is partial equivalent model for technology selection. Okay, and to find out sectoral emission, and then some result like which technology makes we input to the CG model, right? The CG model of AIM can tell us some impact such as the change in GDP, the change in welfare. And finally, we present this kind of result to stakeholders. Okay, and then this year, next year, 2022, we have to repeat this process again, but shortened, because we already have the target of carbon neutrality 2050. Yeah, so this is the story of the success of AIM application in Southeast Asia. We also have to thank and acknowledge NAS who invest in AIM in Asia for a long time, more than 10 years. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you for it. Has been a success. I would try to synthesize your intervention on the use of the AIM model in Thailand. So unfortunately, we don't have much time to discuss in depth, or we're just an hour in all, so it's very difficult to concentrate all the messages in 1 hour. So I will now give the floor to Miss Julia Taraponfaf. Julia is the co-head of the Research Unit International Energy Transition at the Wuppertal Institute. Her primary research areas are the development of sustainable transition strategies and renewable energy concept for developing and emerging countries. The research project she leads focus on the complex social, economic and technical interactions in the context of the energy transition and the development towards a low carbon economy. So it is not so strange that I can address Julia with this question, which first of all concentrate on hydrogen. We have already heard by Marcello the role of hydrogen is certainly one piece of the puzzle towards net zero. My question specifically is what is the role from your perspective of international cooperation when we talk about the development of hydrogen? And again, also, what are the sustainability aspects or the risks to consider international cooperation in hydrogen? So, so Julia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So as we already heard in the first presentation, that hydrogen will be an important topic for international collaboration. And I will first want to look a bit at the question why, because, for example, if we want to decarbonize our economy in Europe until 2050, hydrogen will be an important pillar to reach this target, especially in sectors that are cannot be directly electrified, like the industry processes or heavy transport, aviation, maritime transport. So hydrogen will be necessary to reach our targets. But if we look at the potential, for example, in Europe or also specifically in Germany, we would want to do it alone, we cannot, because we don't have enough potential, or rather we don't have enough potential that can be tapped to supply all the hydrogen we would need. So imports will be necessary, and this is also outlined, for example, in the German strategy, hydrogen strategy, where we have like currently about 80% imports of hydrogen expected to fulfill our targets. This might change a bit with the new coalition who wants to focus more strongly on producing also hydrogen within Germany and within Europe. But in any case, we will need to import from outside Europe, and also the European strategy was already mentioned, has a 40 gigawatt capacity installment plan for Europe, but the same amount is expected to be necessary to be built outside Europe to supply Europe with green hydrogen or its subsequent products. So then if we look at the countries from where we would likely import hydrogen, these are the countries, of course, who have good solar and wind potential and could produce hydrogen more cheaply, and these are often developing or emerging economies. So in order for them to bring them to a level to be a producer and exporter of green hydrogen, there needs to be a lot of collaboration on technology transfer, knowledge transfer, development of the renewable energy sectors in these countries. And of course, we will also require standard setting on technology levels on international level, because this cannot be done by one country or a group of countries, but has to be done internationally. And we come to the sustainability aspects, especially when we talk about countries which have a very low share of renewables currently. It needs to be assured that becoming a producer and exporter of hydrogen does not put any risk at the national energy transition. So also the national energy transition towards renewables in these countries must be supported, and there must be international collaboration on this to how to bring everybody on the path to renewables, and not only the countries like Europe or Japan. Other aspect that would be important in terms of sustainability, of course, the environmental externalities, the negative impact that could occur, because producing hydrogen will need water and land, and this in regions where we have a lot of solar potential, often we already have water stress situations. So it will be important to also look at these aspects to make the hydrogen production really sustainable, not only from a carbon reduction point of view, but also from a holistic point of view, including environmental aspects, but also aspects as socio-economic development. Yeah. So this would be my
Thank you, Julia. No, it's very interesting what you have said, because it seems that the window of opportunity opens to other countries which are not very present in the area of renewables. So it's very interesting, your observation. I also saw Marcello nodding on when you talk about that we cannot produce all the hydrogen we have to use. So that's a point. Thank you, Julia. So I would like to go to Petra Manderscheid. Petra is the Executive Director of the Joint Programming Initiative Connecting Climate Knowledge for Europe, JPI Climate, at the Central Secretariat based in Brussels. Petra, my question is, if you could give us a description of the JPI, Joint Programming Initiative, and highlight what are, in your opinion, the point of strengths and weakness of this initiative. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that was the technical test. Thank you, Sergio. Let me also thank Julia Gallucci from the Central CMCG Mediterranean Center of Climate Change, that is a partner of the LCS and who brought us in contact here. And CMCC is also a member of JPI Climate. So let me just give you a bit of an insight into what JPI Climate is, what we stand for. It's a joint programming initiative aimed to connecting climate knowledge for Europe. It's an intergovernmental collaboration of major research funders in Europe, ministries and funding agencies, with the aim to jointly address the challenge of climate change. So our mission is to actively inform and enable the transition to a low emission, resilient society, and to inform this transition actively. So the framing of this is in line with the European and also the global policy goals, such as the European Green Deal, and we heard about that by Marcello's intervention at the beginning, and also including the new European missions, on the one on climate adaptation, on climate neutrality, but also on soils and oceans, and of course to address the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have currently 19 European countries on board. We have been established by the Council of the European Union back in 2009. So over the last over 10 years of our existence, we have invested into 70 transnational climate research projects to implement our strategic research and innovation agenda, which focuses on basically 3 areas. The first area is understanding the processes and consequences of climate change, so fundamental science. The second is improving the knowledge on climate-related decision-making processes and measures. That touches upon all the realm also of climate services. And the third is researching sustainable societal transformation in the context of climate change. And we have addressed those challenges with various projects, as I said, over 17 over the last 10 years. So we work how we work together in a strategic mechanism, what we call connecting people, problems and solutions. So this frames the activities of JPI Climate and our partners. We collaborate strongly with the European Commission. The European Commission is actually a member of our governing board. We seek for complementarities and synergies and together in the context of the European research area. But this is, of course, European focus, but of course, climate change is transnational and global by nature. So in that sense, we strongly focus on international collaboration. We have a global counterpart of group of funders, which is called the Belmont Forum, which you are probably aware of. This forum gathers major global sustainability research funders from the two Americas, from Japan, China, India, and also Africa. So in this context, we have collaborated and had a major joint activity that just was completed last year. We had 8 projects still on fundamental science, on climate predictability and inter-regional linkages. And there, just as an example, a project that was funded under this program is called InterDEC, the potential of seasonal to decadal scale inter-regional linkages to advance climate prediction. And the partners here are from all over the world. We have China, Germany, Japan, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. And that was an important important global activity that we launched. So there are others, and I don't want to go into detail here. Just what we do to see how important the international collaboration is for us. We have since 2017 been in a program called Sincere, Strengthening International Collaboration in Climate Change, where we have European and global partners in the consortium, including the African Academy of Science, the Argentinian Ministry of Science and Education, and here actually we developed flagship programs for 2 regions, for Latin America and for Africa, who focused on strengthening the networks, so to bringing the actors together. This is key in order to pave the way for future actions. So we participated in all co-organized events on major conferences such as the Adaptation Futures Conference, and linked also to high-level policy dialogues between Europe and Latin America, which is called the EU CELAC program, but also with Africa. So just there's a lot of work to be done before in order to be able to strengthen these connections. So for Latin America, this resulted actually in the development of a joint programming in a call that is now out on the specific topic on biodiversity, the crossroads of climate change. This is including 14 countries, 6 from Latin America and 5 from Europe. So that all those are let's say promising ways of how to strengthen these future actions that we aim for. Yeah, I think strategically, internationally, globally, or European, strategically, we are now focusing more and more on the acceleration and the transfer of knowledge towards decision making. This is really the key, what we invest in. And we have launched a series of knowledge hubs that will act as a mechanism to bring science and practitioners together. The one to mention here probably is the one on climate neutrality that was launched at the COP26 in a side event. This This builds upon a series of activities we have prepared beforehand, and on the need that we have confirmed with the key actors to there's a need for a mechanism to bring the science, the best available science, together with practitioners, with policymakers. And I want to mention here the first climate neutrality forum that we organized in September together with Oxford University and also with the CMCC in Milan, and also with the Mercator Research Institute, where we brought together 1,000 academics and in climate policy, and also private sector participants, especially from the banking sector, to discuss with us in a format of 2 days, and there were subsequent webinars focusing on various topics. So that is something we will focus more on, providing this forum of exchange where the assessed science can be communicated and lead to impact. And I would say the strength here is the support of the countries, so the national support that we have in our board. And for very personally, I think collaboration, especially in international context, is really relating on trust, and trust can be built in when the exchange and the forum is there to do that. So that would be my...
Perfect, Petra. Okay, we had just a flavor of the tremendous complexity that is behind the words international cooperation, that can cover a lot of issues, very technological specific, to fundamental science, to capacity building, etc. So we don't have, perhaps we have just 2 minutes to finish this session, and I would go back to the 2 presenters, that is Toshi and Marcello, because the question from my point of view is what are the key characteristics for a successful international collaboration to achieve net zero emission. I read just some publication by the TEC, the Ecological Transitions Committee, that is the strategic branch of the technology mechanism at COP. And they highlighted first the strong political will as an element. The second is voluntary approach, as perhaps Marcello said in his presentation, and also the kind of flexibility that each country could have in choosing, in the case of mission innovation, the kind of innovation challenge that they want to grasp or to work on. So I would like to ask Marcello and Toshi for these 2 minutes as a final remarks on this kind of key characteristics, as they agree on that, or if they could add other kind of key characteristics to have a successful international cooperation. Marcello.
It's me, okay. Well, the political will is of course very important, but it's not enough, since if we want to achieve the challenging targets and goals, we need to involve the industries, of course, because since technologies are managed by industry, so we have to prepare the right level field for the participation of industries. In Europe, we have a number of financial instruments to support investments, such as Horizon Europe, Innovation Fund, IPCC, and so on. At international level, it's not so easy. For example, in the hydrogen sector, we receive every day from industries proposals of projects. They want to invest, but they ask us a legal framework. Today is not so easy to produce, to use in particular. You can produce hydrogen, but who is going to buy this hydrogen today. That's the point. So we have to work very hard on the involvement of industries just to create the proper framework, not only from the financial side, because many industries in Italy and Europe, they are able to invest without financial support, but they need to have a regulatory framework able then to impact on the investment. Today we have the so-called recovery fund in Europe. I have no time to go in detail, but Sergio, you know very well. It's an extraordinary opportunity for Europe, in particular for Italy. We have a large amount of resources, but it's not a problem of investing in technologies, but also in preparing reforms and legal frameworks able to exploit these investments.
And you are very involved in this process, Marcello. And I would thank you for the time you found to participate at this meeting. So Toshi, your final words.
Oh yes, thank you, Sergio. Yeah, I fully agree Sergio the points, but I think I add something that from my point of view, the long-term perspective is needed for the collaboration. But the actions should be done immediately. So that's the way to achieve the carbon neutrality. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, very cute. So I'm forced to put this session to an end. So I would like to thank all the speakers, all the panelists. So my duty will be to prepare a synthesis of this discussion. I will do it very synthesized. I mean 2 pages, and I will circulate among the speakers and panelists to have an agreement on that. So it has been an honor for me to chair this session, and thank you very much for all your support and insight.
Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you.
Ciao. Ciao.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Cool. Ciao. Ciao.
Okay, I apologize for perhaps just took too much time for this session. So I would like to ask the Secretariat to take the floor and go ahead with the program. Thank you
very much, Sergio. And then we'd like to start the session 4. Stick to the schedule so that we'd like to invite Christine to the chair of the session 4. Thank you. So Christine, so floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm so happy that you have included a session on finance for liberating climate neutral societies, because we all know that by the end of the day we need financing in order to get this moving. Just to introduce myself, I'm the co-CLA of the concluding chapter in the ongoing 6th assessment report of IPCC Working Group 3, where we are discussing how sustainable development and mitigation can be aligned. So this is my background. And what will happen now is that we will first invite Yannick Glimmerack from the Green Climate Facility to make a presentation of 15 minutes, and then Nukatuba Pula, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it, Juby from Climate and Development Finance. Maybe you should pronounce it for me.
It's Noctula. Noctula. Yes.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Yeah, she will also make a 15-minute presentation, and then we have two panelists, and one is Jean-Charles Urquhart from France, and he has been very active in the IPCC debate about finance. And then it will be Michael Morishita from IDEAS that will talk about the Japanese climate finance. So I think this is a very important session. So let us just get started.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. And Noctula, it's really great to have the opportunity to be on a panel with you. And same thing, Jean-Charles. And Michael, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to meet virtually. So because my presentation includes a lot of visuals, I will use a PowerPoint. So basically financing the transition to net zero climate resilient societies will require a substantial increase in investment. According to some estimates, it's anywhere between $3 to $7 trillion annually that we will need to mobilize in order first to address the current investment gap in infrastructure and make sure that the infrastructure of tomorrow are low carbon and climate resilient. Next slide. Normally we should not have a problem to be able to mobilize $3 to $7 trillion a year, because you have right now several $trillion of assets earning negative interest rate in OECD countries. And according again to some estimate, you will have $26 trillion of potentially attractive investment in climate-friendly infrastructure in the world, and the bulk of it in developing countries. However, this is not happening. Right now, we have very little capital flow from OECD countries to developing countries. Next slide. And one of the reasons is because there are a number of actual or perceived barriers to investment. For example, you will not invest in a wind power plant if you need the authorization of 24 of regulatory agencies for your sitting license, or if fossil fuels are heavily subsidized. So you have a number of political and regulatory, macroeconomic and technical barriers to investment in climate-friendly infrastructure in developing countries, and all this risk, these barriers translate into risk, and this risk translate into a higher cost of financing. Basically, entrepreneurs and investors want a higher return on their money in order to offset this perceived or actual risk. And this basically makes the difference between a project that is profitable in a low financing environment and not profitable in a high financing environment. And so if we want to catalyze finance to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to remove these barriers. And the next slide, close to 5,500 climate policies have been developed throughout the world, and in order to try to remove these barriers. And they can be divided between information and barriers, regulatory barriers, economic barriers, institutional barriers. We have two main schools two main philosophies for basically selecting the right instruments. You have the market fixing philosophy, where basically it's very much relying on carbon pricing, trying to make sure that you come with a carbon tax or a cap and trade system in order to basically price carbon and send the right signal to investors, who after will basically change their investment decision accordingly. So this is something that's I'm calling market fixing with my colleague in crime, Jean-Charles Urquhart, with whom we have worked together on this slide. You have another main school of thought, which we call market shaping, where you put rather the emphasis on the sectoral barriers, sectoral policies, technological policies. And so there you try to have a number of measures to create a demand and to create a supply for some very specific type of investment. And for anybody who has been in our industry for a while, you will know that you can have hours and hours of debate between the tenets of carbon pricing versus the tenets of industrial, technological, or sectoral policies. And so between those who say a carbon tax will basically lift everything, and those who say, if you look at the past 30 years, it's policies such as the feed-in tariff in Germany in the beginning of the 90s that have really moved the needle. The experience of the Green Climate Fund is that actually you need both. You need all the different type of instruments. Barriers are unique to every single geography. And for every single geography, you will have to try to come with the best possible portfolio of instruments. And I will try to illustrate it through a number of slides. Next. In this graph, we show basically a low carbon climate resilient project such as solar energy or wind power in an OECD country where the cost of money right now is extremely low. Today, solar energy and wind energy is basically cost competitive with high carbon projects. And the risk that your project will not be commissioned on time, on scope, and on budget is relatively low because you have an established regulatory framework, you have a fairly predictable supply of skills, and you have a commercial track record. Now let's take exactly the same project, but in developing countries, in a high-cost environment. Next slide. Here we have a completely different picture. This time, the green project, the cumulative cash flow of the green project is lower. Why? Because green projects basically have higher capex, have a higher upfront cost for lower operation and maintenance costs, lower OPEX. Establishing a solar power plant or a wind power plant will cost you more money at the beginning, but you will not have after to buy fossil fuels. And so you basically trade the higher capex for lower OPEX. The problem when you are in a high financing environment is that your capex become prohibitively expensive. And even if you save money throughout the rest of the project life in terms of OPEX, it's not enough for your project to be competitive with a high carbon alternative. In addition, you might be in an environment where the policy framework is incomplete, the regulatory framework is incomplete. You might not have the a ready supply of skilled labor, and there might not be any kind of track record of that technology in that area, and therefore your upfront risk, the risks that your project will not be commissioned on time, on scope, and on budget, and that suddenly you will have huge cost overrun and your banker will pull the plug on you, is quite high. And that's the reason why a project in OECD countries that get financed will not obligatory get financed in the developing country. And here, in both cases, same project and same rationale, same type of rationale. Next slide. So what can we do in order to address this situation? And so you can imagine, for example, that you will use a carbon tax, and the carbon tax will basically depress the return of your high carbon project, and suddenly your low carbon project, your green project, is more attractive. It's always difficult politically to come with a very, very high carbon tax. So you might try to use a smaller, softer carbon tax, but at the same time increase the revenue of your green project through, for example, lower interest rate, thanks to the fact that you have strengthened the regulatory framework, for example, facilitated the access to a sitting license, or that you are providing concessional loans. Suddenly, your cumulative cash flow for your green project looks much better, but you still have the risk of upfront overrun because you have no commercial track record. And for example, your equipment might get stuck in custom because one policy is missing, or you have one piece of equipment that does not operate as planned. And so for an investor, that's become a major issue when you have a graph like that. Do you go for it or not? And most likely the answer will be no. The risk associated with a cost overrun means that they will stay put. And so despite the fact that you have done an effort in terms of carbon taxes, despite the fact that you have tried to come with concessional loan, you might actually not have not have an appropriate supply of project. And that's the situation where we are, today we have a lot of institutional investors that are looking for bankable project, and the supply is not obligatory there. The next slide. And so in some location, you will have to keep using more and more instruments. And for example, you might decide to come not only with a carbon tax, but also with concessional loans or regulatory work in order to lower the interest rate. And you might come with upfront de-risking device, such as for example, grant for project development, or first loss equity for construction cost, or a guarantee that in case of cost overrun, 50% of your cost will be guaranteed by the state. And there, suddenly for an investor, the project makes sense. If you are a green investor, you go for the green one, because even if you have a cost overrun, you have enough of a safety net to ultimately end up with a cumulative cash flow at the end that is superior for a green project than for a high carbon project. But you can see that we have used a portfolio of instruments. Next one. And we can continue. For example, in order to further strengthen the position of green investment, we can develop the capacity of a domestic financial institution to incorporate in their investment appraisal methodologies the climate physical risk and climate transition risk. The risk that, for example, your road, which is a conventional design, will be washed away after a climate-related extreme weather event, or the fact that your coal-fired power plant will have to be prematurely closed because basically it will be banned. And that's through this additional type of initiative, you come with an extremely serious case for a green project, and you can expect to see a dramatic increase in investment. The main conclusion there is that it will very much depend on your country, and it's very likely that not a single instrument will make it. That's you will have to come with a combination of instruments to identify the most effective and efficient solution. And that is one of the dramatic challenges that all financiers face in the world today to finance climate project. It's basically develop the skills to identify and implement an optimal portfolio of environmental policy instruments. One does not de-risk a climate project the way one de-risks a conventional project. Now, for the Green Climate Fund, recognizing that the Green Climate Fund is following a four-pronged approach. The first thing is that we support the effort of developing countries to put in place an enabling policy environment to reduce the regulatory, the macroeconomic, the policy, the business, and the technological risk. After, we often we help entrepreneurs to come with a functional solution, to have basically the proof of concept. And we have developed a number of specialty financing instruments for early growth finance. Most entrepreneurs, most innovators in developing countries cannot access early growth finance. And therefore, we have developed, for example, equity funds to provide equity to small and medium enterprises piloting new solutions for adaptation of off-grid energy in Africa. Once we have a functional solution, there we try to basically de-risk the deployment of that solution at a commercial scale through blended finance, through basically using our public money and blending it with private money to come with a number of different de-risking solutions. And so that's the case I was giving, where we might come with 2, 3, 4 different type of instruments. And once we have established a commercial track record, the last step is basically to deepen, to develop the capacity of domestic financial institutions to access capital, to originate and access capital market to finance their replication. And my last slide is one example of a project, Climate Investor 1. That's the fund approved with a number of other partners in 2018. It's an $850 million fund managed by FMO, Dutch financial institution. And there, basically, we are providing development fund grant or development loan for all the projects feasibility study and the entire development stage, in order to reduce the risk of cost overrun at the beginning. After, and for GCF, we have provided basically $20 million of grant. Now, once the project basically moves toward the construction phase, there we are providing equity for the construction, and GCF decided to provide first loss equity. We are the first to lose our money if the projects cannot be constructed and commissioned on time. And this provides enough safety for other institutional investors to come in. Part of this equity is used to recapitalize the development fund, ensuring that the entire financial engineering is sustainable. And once a project has been commissioned, a renewable energy project becomes a plain vanilla project. It's basically your operation and maintenance is much easier than a conventional project, and there you can use refinancing, different type of refinancing schemes, where you float a bond on capital markets, and it's enable you to get back your money. And it's provide early exit to equity financing. So here it's an example of a project where we have been using different type of de-risking instruments throughout the entire project cycle. Thank you very much. I will stop here. For any further information on these approaches, there are 2 publications that describe the type of work that we are doing.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting, I think, also because in Denmark, I often talk to people in our big pension funds, and they will always complain that they do not have enough bankable projects. So it's really an issue to try to reduce the risk in these projects, because they're looking for investment options. Now I'll give the floor to, I actually got a chat from Noctula. I learned something to make a presentation.
Good afternoon. I'd like to share with you some thoughts around the challenges of mobilizing finance on the ground in developing countries, including mobilizing local capital markets. Next slide, please. Developing countries tend to be the least prepared for COVID-19, and they're the most vulnerable to climate change and already face existing SDG financing gaps. And all of these challenges, if we look at them taken together, they require mobilizing trillion-level resources. And often, they're kind of requirements around enabling environments, sort of strengthening enabling environments, financial markets, and harnessing innovations. We also, I'd say that in general, there's a need for strengthening institutional capacity, including scientific institutions and approaches. If we look at another area which would benefit would be in expanding collaboration, in also in open access to better and more climate data, as well as in modeling and early warning system. And I think in all of these areas, I would say there is a great need for mobilizing local actors in strengthening resources. In particular, I think I'd say that local-led increasingly is also very important, because in all of these different geographies, in different developing countries are not homogeneous. We have developing countries that are at different stages of development. So all of these types of challenges, countries, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Different countries will face different levels, for instance, of institutional capacity. Next slide, please. So I think if we look at, for example, strengthening opportunities to strengthen local financial and bond market systems, we would say we have the opportunity to strengthen, if we look at the fact that different developing countries in different geographies are also at different stages of financial markets and different stages of development for bond markets. So for example, we could look at labeled bonds in the mobilizing and allocation of capital for both Paris and SDGs through strengthening domestic local capital markets, for example. And if we look at the table, there is a legion of ways in which bonds can be structured to match the risk-return profile for different investors. And perhaps also we can look at mobilizing both local and international institutional investors, for example. And we could look at ways of stimulating innovation of financial instruments, innovations around investment products tailored for local and diaspora populations. And I think in terms of challenges as well, we can look at supporting countries with both their NDC development, taxonomy developments, because all of these countries, and typically developing countries tend to be carbon intensive and at different stages in their just transition towards low carbon. So, and in this current, sort of current environment, there are compounding effects from climate change, from COVID-19 and high debt levels in developing countries, including, sort of the borrowings that sovereigns have made on international capital markets and the Eurobonds, for example. So this is a good opportunity for us to be asking the question, how best can we strengthen local currency capital markets? How best can we strengthen local financial and bond markets? Next slide, please. And I think if we look at a couple of thoughts around COP26, there's some very important announcements, very relevant for developing countries. We saw, for example, the COP26 delivery plan talk about the 100 billion UNFCCC Copenhagen commitment, and this plan acknowledges the importance of prioritizing grant-based finance, which Yannick mentioned, which is very important, particularly in developing countries, in not just mobilizing private capital, but in also towards supporting non-market-based activities, such as strengthening the regulatory environment, such as strengthening the policy environment that we mentioned. We also saw the Multilateral Fund, a climate investment fund, and make an announcement about starting a capital markets mechanism, which is about mobilizing capital markets and leveraging the multilateral balance sheets, for instance. And they're earmarking about $50 billion entry into the bond markets in terms of supporting the acceleration of clean energy transitions and sustainable infrastructure in developing countries. We also saw the announcement of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is very useful. Remembering we mentioned that they're soft, generally, we tend to see soft institutional capacity in developing countries, and we don't have such good data in terms of the, for instance, SDG impact. And with only a couple of years to go to the 2030 UN 2030 Agenda Agreement, I think it's an important area for us to ask questions around how can we better improve data and to inform decision making if we are going to increase the volume and scale of capital. And there's also questions around improvements of transparency, integrity, and harmonizing for impact in particular. So I think there's very strong support for the International Sustainability Standards Board in creating these kind of global reporting frameworks, and also that would help particularly investors in terms of climate risks and in terms of aligning risks as well as opportunities. Next slide, please. And I think another area that we saw discussed at the COP26 was kind of around mobilizing the private capital for public good. So we spoke about the 100 billion UNFCCC commitment. If we look on the table, right, the smallest circle there, I think it's a good illustration, the fact that actually that UN 100 billion, which has yet to be met, is actually a drop in the ocean when we look at the needs of developing countries, the scale of the challenge, and these triple challenges, these kind of challenges that we've mentioned, whether it's Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the pandemic financing, and already most are quite highly indebted, facing high cost of capital, for instance, which Yannick mentioned. And I think if you look at that table very quickly, we see that the 100 billion underpins the international climate finance system. And if we build on that, you have the bilateral concessions. And further up, again, you have the multilaterals and Yannick's GCF, for instance, which are catalytic in the market and prioritizing, and especially poor and vulnerable countries. You then have the MDBs that play an important role in mobilizing that capital and providing some of the technical assistance that developing countries need in mobilizing that finance. So it's not just the scale of the financing that tends to be a challenge, but it's equally, you know, sort of having the technical assistance as well in accessing this finance. And I think the largest circle in there we can see is that the private capital, these trillion levels of capital, are still largely quite untapped. And we've seen the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, for instance, that was set up, that's holding trillions of assets under management as financial institutions have joined up. So there's also scope for us to mobilize that large private capital that's yet to be untapped. And we need that ongoing collaboration between public and private actors, both international players and local players inside developing countries. Next slide, please. And I think if I can just move on to give a sort of a case study flavor of some of actors and ideas in terms of the settings in developing countries. And if we take Africa, for instance, it's a continent with a population of about 1 billion people, mostly young people, and mostly carbon-intensive economies. And in this setup, you have, let's have a look at somebody like Flutterwave, which is a local fintech, STEM fintech setup that has raised international financing, multi-million levels of financing for building digital payment systems across several countries in Africa. And this was founded by some science and engineering Africa diaspora funders. And the platform harnesses technology in mobilizing, for instance, diaspora remittances. It's also a platform for SMEs. And it's also potentially a developer environment for climate tech applications, for instance. And this is very encouraging because this is a fintech startup that's now raised something like close to 170 million and is valued at close to $1 billion, as it were. And it's sort of an African unicorn and it's a fintech space that's incredibly popular with investors. And that's a good example of overcoming some of the perceptions of risks that investors have a sense of. I think this is also illustrating that if you could structure the projects together, you can actually it's possible to mobilize some of those investors, particularly in an Africa context where, you know, there are concerns around high debt distress, but it's also showing that there's potential for innovation. I think if we move to the next player, which is a commercial player, Standard Bank is a local bank. It's a strategic partner to Flutterwave, one of the largest, it's also one of the largest African commercial banks. This is developing corporate and consumer products in mobilizing finance and domestic markets. They are also developing just transition plans, low carbon financing pathways, and it's a very active player in both local and international bond markets, and also being challenged to increasingly support the just transitions in the countries that they operate, both towards adjusting and responding to mitigation and adaptation. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. Now, Yannick's GCF that he mentioned, Development Bank of Southern Africa, for example, has a climate finance facility. And one of the core challenges, of course, in this space is really the high cost of capital and also the limited kind of regional climate finance mechanism. So this facility is an intervention on the market that's looking to address those barriers. And that facility is pioneering a green investment bank model and is providing de-risking to lower upfront costs to investments. And you know, so the grant combinations and the equity combinations that were mentioned are particularly important. And again, the local bond markets, particularly here, are also very valuable, particularly because Development Bank of Southern Africa has been an issuer of green bonds and is coming into the market with innovations around mobilizing and syndicating and partnering with other players within these carbon intensive economies. I'd also like to add that if we look at the example that I've provided, the Flutterwave example, that's harnessing science, it's partnering with other local players, it's providing payment systems, and within the energy space, potentially there are areas such as pay-as-you-go, which could be very useful. So mobilizing these kind of local players, harnessing the technology here is very important. And I think institutions such as the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, for example, their capacity building, and this is another area where we need to be continuing to invest resources, is capacity building within R&D for climate change sciences, modeling, data analysis, and early warning systems as well. So this is just to give you a flavor that in an Africa space, for instance, which again is not homogeneous even within that region, the different countries are at different stages of development and at different needs and institutional capacity levels in terms of accessing and mobilizing climate finance. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Also nice to hear some of these sophisticated case studies. I think we should move on now to Jean-Charles Bourquet.
Yes, shall I just be, I have to share my screen. I have a, you see my presentation here or not?
We don't see. Not yet.
Not yet, let me check. I have to come back to the, hola. Écran. Here, yes. This one. That's okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect.
But maybe set it to a slideshow because it's very small.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I will go quickly because what I will say is to talk about the macro decisions that should be made at the next COPs or something like that, to allow for to create a business environment in which we really have a scaling up of low carbon investments. I will go quickly because simply to recap, after all, on paper, the situation is simple. We have countries with constraints for their public budgets, but we have 56 million of millionaires in the world who retain 50% of the world financial wealth. And they put their money now in real estate, in land, in looks, industry, and so on and so forth. And the question is that the major opportunities to abate emissions in the world, 2/3 of mitigation investments need to happen in developing countries. So the problem to be solved is easy: to redirect savings from where they are and to where they should do. They should go. The main problem now is how to trigger that, because you demonstrated very clearly, Yannick and Kutula, that the tools to bring the money to the ground, they are almost there. Well, there are a lot of thinking about that. The question is how to make progress, because this needs progress in regulation, in overall regulation, including financial regulation. What can convince the high-level decision makers to understand that they have to do something? If there is nothing like a big connected push, the world economic post-COVID recovery will be uncertain because of the debt distress in developing countries. That's the first step. Second, there is an enlarged gap between the savings, the capacity to save and capacity to invest in the world, because people are scared and they save a lot and they don't invest. The question now is, there's a huge opportunity to bridge to participate to facilitate to accelerate the post-COVID recovery by reducing the infrastructure investment gap in the world with clean options. So they should be convinced that the COVID, the climate, the scaling up of low carbon investment is an opportunity to accelerate the post-COVID recovery. When we have that in mind, what to suggest? I jumped that because that's what is the main problem. Let us start with the notion of risk. You developed that perfectly well. We need de-risking. So you have project initiators there. They have projects. These guys, they risk their own money. Then you have the institutional investors who managed mostly the savings of you and me, of everybody in the world. Okay? And they are risk adverse. So what to do now? We need de-risking. I put here a country R, which is a rich country, and poor. Okay. What is the trick? Obviously, both countries, they have to enforce policy and financial de-risking by better legal context, administrative, lowering the administrative costs and so on and so forth. But the key is that if we want to scale up developing countries in these, to scale up investment in developing countries, we have really a problem of credit worthiness of these countries, with a spread in the debt, in the public debt, the public loans, which is really important. So the key is to have the developing countries put on the table upfront de-risking of this investment in the form of AAA guarantees to cut the risk upfront very quickly, and they can do that. An investment in Zimbabwe, in Brazil, in India will have the guarantee of equivalent to the US, France, Germany, and so on and so forth. If you do that, obviously what is simple, but then you can have access to loans at lower interest rates and longer maturity. That's easy. Where starts the problem? The problem starts that is not enough, because here you have the overall system in blue. There is that if you have new loans for developing country, then the question is that the central bank of this country has to recognize in their refinancing operation, then they will repay part of the debt. Okay, and then the problem is that for the rating agencies, this good news. I help you to develop low carbon projects as low rates will start to be a debt in its balance sheet. So what we need is that the central banks recognize that, and that this recognized all over the world, including in the central banks in their interpayment facility, interpayment swaps. This means that part of the game is in the hands of people who conduct the regulation of the financial systems, questions of debt swap, the Basel III and Solvency II regulations will penalize the long-term investments, and we have to facilitate the recognition of new asset classes. And the trick for the negotiations is what? Is that what is in green and red here is in the hands of the UNFCCC. The rest, in blue, is in the hands of other places of regulation of the international system. So what to do? My remark would be that something is in our hands. We cannot change everything. If we wait for a total reform of the financial system, nothing will happen in 2, 3, 5 years. But we can do something at this first stage and then look at what might happen later in the blue stage there, which is in the upper side of this slide. So we conclude here. The question now is, what is possible? Is that the OECD countries make an offer, put on the table, an offer of guaranteeing the low carbon investment in developing countries. For them, that's good bargain because obviously they can absolutely have public cost of these commitments easily offset by the fiscal revenues of the export content of the generated activities. For developing countries, the gain is obvious. But I will insist in 1 minute to the conditions for that. You know what? I know whether it's good. It's good news. Is at COP there was a commitment by the US, Germany, France, and so on to cancel the swap, to cancel the debt of the first utility in South Africa, in exchange of the fact that they stop using coal for producing electricity. That's very hard. I'm not sure whether the South Africa will succeed. But the problem for the climate negotiation is that it's not enough to build to launch a circle of trust, because this resembles a technique historically known, which is that, well, I look at a country, I look at where there is fragility, and then I negotiate with them. It would be better to have a commitment with multi-sovereign initiatives, the same for all the countries over the world, to generate a circle of trust, because this resembles a new form of ecological colonialism. To prevent this type of distrust, it would be better to have a common commitments on agreed upon assessment rules. That's very important, that can be transparent, shared, improved over time, and likely to agree on to calibrate all these supports with the same avoided value, with the value of avoided carbon emissions. This is in line of the Article 108 of the decision of the Paris Agreement. And the last thing is absolutely to defragment this, as we said by the two previous interventions, the defragmentation of the climate and development finance, and to help the MDBs and the NDBs to work synergistically. So my insistence, and to conclude there in 5 minutes, to say, okay, what is needed to scale up is confidence, is to launch a circle of trust. And I think it's possible to launch that with this insistence of transparency on the cooperation mechanisms of how do we account for the cross-border flows. Perhaps last word to say that there's a huge experience in the CDM, in the world, in the development banks, in the Green Climate Fund, to develop assessment techniques which should be shared and agreed upon, because it's really the basis of trust. And so I conclude here and let's stop here.
Okay. Thank you. It was really nice to see such a solution presented. And now we are running out of time, so we really have to focus a lot. We have, I will now invite Maiko Morishita.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you, first of all, for this opportunity. I am trying to share my slides.
It works.
Good. Okay, so I will speak briefly on Japan's climate finance mobilization. status and policies deployed, both on public and private finance. So I'll go quickly. So just to recap Japan's climate finance commitments, Japan committed to a total of $60 billion over the next 5 years. Earlier this year, the G7 summit, and more recently in Glasgow, an additional 10 billion. So that's a total of $70 billion over the next 5 years. So on average, roughly around 14 billion a year. Now, reflecting very quickly on kind of the performance to date of Japan's climate finance for developing countries. The graph on the left-hand side shows top climate finance contributing countries. The figures are cumulative for the 3 years following Paris, so between 2016 and 2018. As you can see, Japan is the provider of largest provider of public finance. So in the government's own words, it's made a sizable contribution, but it does come with some caveats. So the dark green component of the graph represents the grant equivalent of financing. So Japan has a very limited use of grants next to France at 14%. There is very limited support for adaptation, 8% for these 3 years. And the amount also includes financing for high efficiency coal power fire plants. So it seems that Japan is applicable to some of the, or perhaps many of the criticisms that are often directed towards claims of mobilized public finance. Of course, there are arguments for and against these claims, and the purpose, I think, here is not to get into the details there, but just to say that we do need to do much better in agreeing on accounting and reporting rules, not just on public finance, but private finance, and also taking a look at the nature and also quality of the projects and activities that are being financed. Finally, on Japan's private finance mobilization measures. So these don't necessarily distinguish between financing provided in or for developed and developing countries. But nonetheless, the Ministry of Environment was earliest in its body of work of issuing guidelines and providing subsidies for green instruments. Most recently, there's been further work undertaken on disclosure and on climate risk analysis support, and a joint effort by the MOE, the Financial Services Agency, METI, and the Bank of Japan. What stands out for Japan is its focus on transition finance, let's say, in contrast to the work on the taxonomy by the EU. Agencies collaborated and issued the basic guidelines on climate transition finance earlier this year. And notable in the ongoing development of industry roadmaps by METI. So these are meant to provide clarity and support, technical support to companies developing transition pathways, and allow them the use of the so-called transition label in their financing. So I would say, I mean, more can always be done and more is necessary, but it's a fairly comprehensive package of sustainable finance policy that has been deployed very recently. The key missing pieces seem to be beyond kind of the scope of sustainable finance policy. So, and which are kind of indicated on the right-hand side, and most importantly, being what I guess some would perceive as kind of a lack of ambition or decisiveness in transforming Japan's energy policy, and also kind of the lack of clarity that seems to exist in possibly forthcoming approaches to carbon pricing and measures and schemes. So I would be inclined to argue that the key to accelerating private climate finance mobilization in Japan would be in ramping up market shaping efforts on top of kind of the market, not correcting, but market fixing approaches that are currently existing. But then again, I am rather biased because I am currently following kind of the sustainable finance policy developments more closely. Yes, for now, I will stop here and hand it back over to Kristen.
Thank you so much. And it's really good to know that Japan is leading these efforts, and we hope that other countries would follow that. I think we have only 5 minutes left, so what I will do now is to give the final floor to Yannick first, and after that to Noktula, because I think that our panelists have actually raised a lot of additional exciting issues, and there's also a question on the Q&A, which is about specific challenges in African countries and geopolitical aspects. But I think the two presenters now have 2 minutes each, not more than that. So, Yannick, are you ready?
Yeah, I think it's first, many thanks. I think for me, one of the most striking thing is that all the presentation were speaking to each other, and there was a real community of views, which is good. I think I can guarantee to you that 20 years ago, if we had had a similar event, it's very unlikely that you will have had 4 different presenters who, by and large, provided the same type of recommendation. And hopefully, that might mean that we have now reached a critical mass where we can influence what you call the high-level decision makers, Jean-Charles, and hope to make sure that we do not wait 10 more years before the required policies are put in place. For the African challenge, I will leave it to Noktula, but for example, in terms of difference of price of spread for the cost of capital, has been estimated to, it's very difficult to assess, but some have estimated it to 2 to 3% for solar and power and wind, but some are speaking about differences ranging from 8 to 32% in the cost of financing across Africa. So you can imagine a project that is profitable with basically 4 or 5% financing cost is not to be profitable with 8 or even less 32%.
I would share Yannick's view, particularly on the cost of capital in general. That observation is a very important one for both developing countries and developed countries to take recognition of, because it is one of the key barriers. And as Yannick points to, particularly in a place like Africa, the cost of capital is incredibly high. And these aspects, this is why I think we find there is this call for more grant equivalent financing. If we look at the corporate delivery plan that we mentioned, and if we look at Maiko's discussion, which is recognizing that these grants, because it needs to come to be de-risking. I would also say that I think it's very encouraging to see the sense of this discussion recognizing the need for the international cooperation, because developing countries are already facing these challenges. They're already responding to climate change. And of course, this has been compounded by this COVID-19, which we don't yet have visibility, and there's quite uncertainty on that. And just to quickly respond to the geopolitical part of it, I think it's within the nature of developing countries. I think we recognize there is a range, countries are not homogeneous within the developing country space. You have the fragile and conflict affected states, you have the least developed countries, you have the small island developing countries. All of these face specific challenges unique to that environment, and the climate finance has to be mobilized in addressing those unique challenges. And I think if you look at the Addis Ababa agreement, the UN agreement recognizes these countries, and also the Copenhagen Climate Finance Agreement all respond to the special challenges this needs. So I think I'm encouraged in seeing the international cooperation aspect that's being discussed. And I think that there is more calls for public finance like GCF, to raise their ambitions because of the scale of the capital. And of course, I'll go back to the private financing as well, which still remains untapped. But I'll stop there and hand back to Kirsten. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much. And I will also say that I deny to believe that this, I would call it a market failure, because there's such a big economic interest in the OECD countries about finding good investment projects. So if we could find out of a simple way to de-risk these projects, I know all these guys will be running because they are looking for good investments. And I hope that the Low Carbon Society Network would organize soon a special session only on the issues that we are talking about here. Because if we could solve some of these problems, this would really be moving. So I think we should take another session another day. And then I thank you, the Low Carbon Society, for organizing this very inspiring session.